The Warning Woods presents the 2023 Halloween Special. This episode is only one part of a 5-episode series. Be sure to listen to each episode in order. This story will reach its dramatic conclusion at noon on October 31st, Halloween. So without any further ado, let's travel to Proudie, Indiana. This is The Owl. On Friday, October 30th, Proudie residents all got an email as well as a printout taped to their doors. The memo was signed by both Mayor Gina Ashford and Police Chief Bradley Gilbert. The subject line read, "Halloween festivities placed on hold during investigation/curfew in effect." Most of the town had already decorated for Halloween, already purchased candy for the trick-or-treaters, already bought and sized and adjusted costumes for their children. On top of their sunk costs, the residents no longer trusted Proudie's government almost to a person. There were the older folks who had gone to school with Chief Gilbert or still remembered when Mayor Ashford had been a friendly waitress down at McCracken's Diner. Those folks still trusted the people in charge because they couldn't dream of doing otherwise. But those folks were growing rare, and the sudden, inexplicable death of the journalist, the outspoken man who had tried to warn them, first at the picnic and later with a full article detailing the cover-up, had dealt a crippling blow to their numbers. Word had traveled quickly of Andy Laxton's fatal attack. His neighbors on either side could see the damage to his deck and glass door from their homes. On Wednesday, when she had found him, Officer Jennings had to tape off Andy's yard to keep onlookers from gathering too close, but she couldn't keep them out of the neighbors' yards. On either side of Andy's property, 20 or 30 people gathered, watching and taking pictures of the broken house, speculating about who or what could have smashed the door. None of them knew for a fact that Andy was dead, until a couple of paramedics from the nearest hospital wheeled out a gurney with a black tarp over it. What no one in the crowd of onlookers could understand was why the tarp bulged so much. It didn't look like a man's body was under there, as much as maybe a moose's. But that was Wednesday, and this was Friday, and people, at least those without children, had essentially forgotten the danger and only remembered they were being lied to. This was really all anyone could agree on. They knew the government line had been set to mislead them, but the public consensus about what was really happening was split. Many believed the late Mr. Laxton's claims about a winged monster stalking the woods outside of town. These included the people who had seen the pellet containing little Josh Poplar's skeletal remains. The monster side believed the police and DNR were lying because they didn't want to look like idiots. This group figured admitting something strange and unknown was really out there would make the authorities look less capable and credible, so they lied about what it might be. The other side, the killer side, believed all of the monster and wild animal talk was a distraction from a serial killer investigation. They believed the police didn't want Proudie's residents to turn on each other, so they had recruited the DNR into generating rumors about some great predator hunting people down. Some of them even believed the dead journalist had been part of the conspiracy, planted amongst them to spread lies and misinformation while the authorities investigated unwitting citizens. Most in this subset of belief also believed Andy Laxton was still alive somewhere. All of this is to say, when the email canceling all Halloween activities went out, it was scoffed at, laughed at, torn up, thrown out, and deleted. A few plucky residents sent snarky replies to the mayor and chief with varying degrees of profanity. You may think the logical reaction from the monster side would be to keep their children home, but their true reaction was baffling. Many intended to send their kids out. Their desire to protest the government's weak order outweighed their fear of a monster they hadn't seen for themselves. Still, other parents on the monster side, the killer side, and undecided did not want to send their children out into the night to trick-or-treat. They didn't trust the authorities and had no idea what might actually be happening, but they knew for sure a child had been taken and probably killed, and they desperately wanted to keep that from happening to their own offspring. Crosstower Baptist Church immediately took advantage of the opportunity to host an indoor harvest festival with a family lock-in to follow. This is something they had attempted in the past as an alternative for those people who harbor puritanical criticisms of Halloween, but it had never really taken off. Even families who regularly attended Crosstower on Sunday mornings saw nothing but fun in trick-or-treating. If their kids came back possessed by demons, then they would take them to church. So far, that hadn't happened. But the last-minute, ramshackle 2020 Harvest Festival was set to be a success thanks to the fear percolating through town. Flyers made from a Microsoft Word template and printed on standard printer paper, probably in Pastor Gabe's home office, were distributed. They advertised a fun-filled, safe night of games, music, sweets, and worship. Pastor Gabe had often preached about God being a refuge. Well, tomorrow night, on October 31st, referred to by most as Halloween, he hoped to provide a physical representation of God's refuge. His church would keep everyone happy and safe. Maybe some of the kids would tell their parents, "Hey, that Crosstower place is pretty fun, let's go back sometime." The more Proudie split apart due to distrust and disagreement, the more opportunity Pastor Gabe saw to be a unifying force in the community. Perhaps the church could be the center of Proudie again. Nobody died on Friday, October 30th. No one was reported missing on Saturday morning. The strange, exclusively human idea of, "it won't happen to me," overrode everyone's cortexes as they put the final touches on their Halloween decor. Officer Jennings rode slowly through town with her windows down that afternoon. Anytime she saw someone out in their yard nailing a splattered witch to a tree or hanging paper ghosts from the porch, she got on the megaphone and said, "All Halloween activities are canceled. A 7 p.m. curfew will be in effect tonight by order of the mayor's office." Some people laughed at her. Others raised rude gestures in her direction. "Tonight might be a massacre," Crystal Jennings muttered to herself as a rowdy child popped a wheelie on his bike while crossing in front of her cruiser. And oh, how right she would turn out to be. Pastor Gabe was pinning the corner of a large banner when he heard the church's auditorium doors squeal open. The banner had just been dropped off by a member of the Friday morning men's group who happened to own a print shop in South Bend. It wasn't fancy, just a white banner with the words Crosstower Harvest Festival printed in bold, red capital letters, but Pastor Gabe graciously accepted the gift. He thought the banner gave some authenticity to the event. It made it appear pre-planned rather than like some cobbled distraction. "Mr. Pastor Gabe." Gabe recognized Rose Barnum's voice. It was she who had entered the otherwise empty auditorium. "Are you setting all of this up on your own?" Rose asked. "Ha!" He laughed joyously, sounding warm and friendly. "No, others will be along in time. Most of them are home cooking and baking the food for tonight. You'll all be happy I opted to hang the banner instead. Doesn't it look good?" "A little crooked, actually. Sorry, Pastor. Don't want to be dishonest in the Lord's house." Pastor Gabe looked across at the other end of the banner and pursed his lips as he determined Rose was correct. He laughed and pulled out the pin he had used to secure the banner to the wall. "Sharp as a tack, Rose. I suppose that's what makes you a great... Wait a minute. Shouldn't you be down at the station? Surely the chief wouldn't trust anyone else on the phones right now." "It's Saturday. I'm off," Rose said with a shrug. "I would normally be at the library, but I told Rebecca I'm feeling sick so she would find someone else to fill in." "So you're only honest when you're in the Lord's house?" Pastor Gabe winked at her over his shoulder as he readjusted the banner. "Oh, no, Pastor, I didn't lie. I do feel sick. Sick to my stomach." Rose began to cry. Slowly at first, but more with each word. "I feel like I've been part of something terrible. I feel like... You know that journalist who died, Andy? I knew him. He came to me last weekend at the library and said a lot of stuff that he published later on. Not directly, but he implied it. I gave him a few extra details, but look what good it's done. The whole town feels like it might implode. Neighbors are arguing with each other. Parents are fighting over whether their children should be let outside." "Rose," Pastor Gabe crooned as he descended the ladder. "None of this is your fault. It's just the added stress from the disappearances heaping on top of the pandemic. You know everyone's having a hard time. It's been a rough year, and that's putting it lightly. No, you don't understand, Rose said, nearly sobbing now. It's true. It's all true. Everything Andy put in that article. I know because I took the calls when those people went missing and when they were found again. I know because I listened at the chief's door when he was on the phone sometimes. I listened when the mayor came in for a meeting and the two of them decided canceling Halloween and putting a curfew in place would be better than telling the truth. Those were almost their exact words. I've listened and done nothing, and now someone who was doing something is dead. How are you at tying balloons? Pastor Gabe asked. Rose looked surprised. I'm sorry? Well, see, you obviously want to help this community. I admire that, and I want to help too. That's what this is all about. He waved up at the banner, which was still slightly crooked. I planned this event because I know it's going to keep people, especially vulnerable kids, inside instead of out trick-or-treating. Those parents who are fighting each other can bring their kids here rather than keeping them in all night. So if you want to help me keep those kids safe, I could really use some help blowing up balloons. No, Rose said bluntly. All the guilt-ridden sadness was gone from her voice. Her tone bordered on anger. I'm sorry, but no. You need to call this off. You need to comply with the mayor's ban on all Halloween activities. Her motivation is wrong, but it's still the right idea. But Rose, you know the mayor can't keep all those kids off the street. Your chief can't either. No, but I also know people are going to walk or ride or drive over here, have a good time, then make their way home well after dark. A lot of people. And what are you going to do when you wake up tomorrow and hear that someone else has been killed? Someone you recognize from the cakewalk, maybe, Pastor Gabe busied himself with folding up the ladder. He couldn't look at Rose. She was right, but so was he. He had thought of everything she had said already. He understood the risks, but it wouldn't be him making the choice for each and every family who came to the festival. It was why he was opening the sanctuary for a lock-in afterwards. People didn't have to leave if they didn't want to. They would have to make that call and calculate the risks for themselves. His goal was simply to provide refuge for those who wanted it. That was his answer to the 2,000-year-old question, the one written on the rubber bracelets that would be handed out as prizes at the bottle toss. What would Jesus do? It's in God's hands, Rose, not mine. To close his church on a night like this, a night when there is so much unholiness already, would be a slight against him. I understand, Pastor, Rose said, defeated. But my conscience can rest knowing I tried. She turned and walked away. Pastor Gabe called after her, So is that a no to the balloons? Rose went out the door without a response. Officer Jennings' heart hammered in her chest. The dull pain it caused her had been the norm for the past 2.5 days. A vicious cycle of sleeplessness and caffeine abuse had her swimming against the current of a psychological whirlpool. She had been working overtime, patrolling the streets, scanning the woods, making sure all the kids in town were heeding the curfew. The chief had reprimanded her for the extra hours, but when she told him she didn't expect to be paid for them, he calmed down. She was only working because she didn't know what else to do. Even in her restless dreams, when she was too exhausted to avoid sleep any longer, she found herself driving the streets of Proudie, watching the woods like a hawk, like an owl. Andy had been right to blow the lid off the cover-up. Jennings accepted that now that he was dead. The monster had consumed him inside his own home. Worse, it must have lingered there while it digested him, because it had deposited his bones there as well. The pellet had still been warm and steamy when Jennings found it. If this thing was smashing its way into houses now, it didn't matter if they canceled Halloween or had a curfew in place. Getting everyone off the street might make it slightly more challenging for the monster to find prey, but it certainly didn't seem like any measures could stop it from killing. Only killing the monster would do that. And that's what Officer Crystal Jennings had decided to do. It was time to go on the offensive. It was time to flip the script. Chief Gilbert had sent her out to shut down the Crosstower Harvest Festival, but she had decided not to. She agreed with the pastor. Not about Halloween being satanic and all that, but about giving people somewhere to go. If she lost her job over her insubordination, so be it. She wasn't sure how much longer she could take being bossed around by fat old Chief Gilbert anyway. Jennings had called a sergeant over at St. Joseph County to see if she could get any backup that night. The other 2 Proudie officers would be on duty, but Jennings had zero faith in her colleagues. The SJC sergeant had told her Halloween was one of their busiest nights, so they couldn't spare anyone. He assured her they would send help if Proudie had an emergency, though. This is the problem, Jennings thought. Everyone's ready to help clean up, but no one wants to prevent the mess from happening in the first place. She passed between 2 trees and had to squint as a direct ray of sunlight hit her windshield. The sun was on its way down. Soon it would be dark. She passed a group of junior high kids dressed up as characters from Tiger King. Each child had a plastic grocery store bag in hand, ready to collect candy. She rolled down her window and pulled up to the curb. "Hey, you guys know trick-or-treating is off tonight, right? You're gonna have to wait for next year." "That's not what everybody else is saying," Carol Baskin's mini-me sneered. "Well, either way, the curfew is still in place, so what are you gonna do, arrest us all?" Tiny Joe Exotic asked. And for a moment, Jennings considered this. What if she did just round up every kid she found outside, locked them up for the night, and let them go when the sun rose? The idea came and went in a flash, obviously ludicrous. Besides, she already had a task, one which would end the problem for good. "Bet she's gonna tell us we have to wear masks, too," Minnie Carroll jeered, receiving a chorus of prepubescent guffaws. She kicked a dirty, blue paper mask someone had left on the sidewalk toward Jennings's cruiser. Jennings leaned out of the window and said, "Guys, look, I'm being straight with you. What happened to that Poplar kid could happen to all of you, too. If you think that's worth a few Tootsie Rolls, be my guest, but I'd be staying home tonight." The jeering kids went quiet, and Jennings rolled on. Beside her, situated in the nook between her computer and the back cage, were a loaded shotgun and AR-15. She hoped these, in concert with her sidearm, would be enough to put the monster down, even if she had to unload every last round into it. Rose walked across the street from Crosstower Baptist and joined a group of people waiting under a broad tree. The same group Andy Laxton had found huddled on the lawn earlier that week. Earlier that afternoon, Rose had rallied them to fight. Heather Trout, an herbal medicine practitioner and wife of the still-missing Reggie Trout. Judson Schultz, the retired firearms instructor and Navy vet who had cut open Josh Poplar's pellet. And the Poplars, Ginny and Bo, parents to Josh Poplar, who had been taken from the church picnic only a dozen yards or so from where they now stood. Finally, there was Carl Grierson, a local bakery owner who had witnessed the Poplar boy's hand falling out of his pellet. "I couldn't talk him out of it," Rose said once she was in earshot. "The festival's still on." "What about the curfew? Can't your officers shut it down?" Heather Trout asked. "They could try, but I'm not sure they will." "Did the pastor forget our son was taken at another event here?" Bo Poplar sneered. "No," Rose said, shaking her head. "But he's convinced himself this is the safest option. After talking to him, I think we all just have to accept that this is happening and do our best to prevent the worst-case scenario. We'll keep watch outside, Rose," Carl Grierson, the baker, said. He was focused on something behind her. "Hold on, Carl, let me explain the whole plan and then we can debate the finer points." Asphalt crunched behind her, and Rose turned. She saw what Carl had tried to warn her about. A Proudie PD cruiser rolled up slowly. The glare from its headlights washed out the windshield and made it impossible to tell who was inside. Rose held a hand above her eyes and squinted. "You all here to help with the festival?" The voice behind the glare belonged to Officer Jennings. The cruiser rolled a little closer, and Rose could see Crystal through the open window. "We're just doing our part to keep this town safe, ma'am," Judson Schultz belted. The firm tone he had perfected in the Navy waned slightly on ma'am, as if he wasn't quite sure it was the proper way to address the young officer. Jennings parked and got out. She approached the group slowly, looking each one of them up and down. She nodded to no one in particular and asked the whole group, "How many of you are armed?" Everyone looked uneasy. Some shared glances with each other, while others shifted their hips slightly away from the cop. "Come on, I'm not out here checking permits," Jennings sighed. Judson slowly raised his hand. Then Heather, Carl, and Ginny Poplar raised theirs. "Rose?" Jennings asked. Rose nodded. "And what about you?" she asked Bo Poplar, who had not yet responded. "We only have one gun, so I let Ginny take it," Bo said. "She's a better shot than me anyway." "Should have said something sooner," Carl, the baker, beamed. As if forgetting the police officer standing right beside him, he raised his long sweatshirt, revealing twin Glocks, one on either hip. He removed the one on his right and passed it to Bo. Unless you object," Carl said to Officer Jennings. "No, not tonight. Tonight all that matters is keeping everyone alive." "So, you're on our side?" Rose asked hopefully. "There's only supposed to be one side," Jennings answered. "I should have listened." She sighed again. "I should have listened to Andy." Rose put a hand on her shoulder. "So should I," she said. "But we're doing the right thing now." Jennings nodded, then asked, "What's your plan?" Rick Santini from the DNR had been alone in the basement of the Proudie Police Department for too long. He had a hair-raising case of the creeps. 3 enormous objects, which he still thought of as pellets, lined the long hallway that led to the supply room. The skeletons within them had long been removed, but their owners' hairs and clothing fibers were still wrapped around and weaved into the pellets, making it impossible to ignore what they were. Rick had returned to the basement to collect another set of samples from the gray molding material. The lab results on the first set he had collected had come back inconclusive, although the technician who provided them said the stuff was very similar to what paper wasps built their homes out of. He could have waited until Monday when he was on the clock, but Rick wanted to see what Proudie was doing for Halloween. He wondered how many people would follow the guidelines, because it didn't seem like many of them would. Maybe that article from the dead journalist would keep a few who would have otherwise gone out home, but not everyone. A wormy-looking thing hung out from the smallest pellet, which still spread wider than Rick's arm span. He kicked at the wormy thing absently, expecting it to crumble, but the dangling thing remained whole. It flaked a little, some of the pieces floated away like ash, but overall, it stayed whole. Rick hadn't noticed anything like this wormy thing when he had examined the first 2 pellets. He had not yet investigated the third, most fresh one, nor had he intended to. Having spoken to the man who was found inside it less than 2 weeks ago, Rick couldn't bring himself to get too close at first. Now, before he could talk himself out of it, he lifted the artificial mouth cut into the pellet and looked inside. He followed the gray tube thing up into the inner layer of the pellet and saw it connected there, opening up like a trachea colliding with an inverted lung. From there, it branched out into a spidery membrane which faded into the texture of the other gray material inside. Membrane. That was a word Rick had not until now associated with the pellets. Owl pellets did not have membranes. They were waste products, regurgitations of undigestible material. But a membrane, that was something meant to protect whatever was inside it. Why would the creature have any reason to protect the desiccated remains of its prey? A heinous idea struck Rick. He let the semi-fresh pellet close and crawled to the next one over. He pried this one, the first pellet discovered, open. It split apart with some effort, cracking and flaking as Rick reopened the dried-out gash. It had lost most of its pliability. Rick slipped his knee into the gash to hold it open, while he fished his phone from his back pocket and then used it to light up the pellet's interior. He scanned the inside of the larger pellet, and slowly, his heart steadied. This pellet did not appear to have the same membranous patterns anywhere inside. Rick slid his knee out. Just before the pellet snapped closed, he saw it. A violent shiver rocked his shoulders as he pried the crack open again. This time he held it open by sheer will and shone the light directly down next to where his knee had been before. And there it was. Almost nothing remained of the wormy, tube-like thing in this pellet, but a strange nub protruded from its inner wall, and it was surrounded by the same spidery pattern he had observed in the fresh one. Rick ran up the police department stairs and into the lobby where Ian sat at the dispatcher's desk. "Is the chief in? I need to talk to him now," he practically shouted as he approached Ian's desk. Ian removed his headset and shook his head. "Sorry, chief doesn't work weekends." Rick swore, then said, "That's all right, I have his number." "I wouldn't bother him unless it's an emergency," Ian said with an air of foreboding. "Oh, it's an emergency all right," Rick said. He was already running to the back door and opening his phone. For all intensive purposes, the sun had set. It was beyond the horizon and now only cast a faint aura of orange light against the ocean gray sky above. The light evening breeze Rick had left when he went inside had become a chilling wind. The treetops rattled and whispered, hiding secrets. As he walked across the parking lot, Rick called Chief Gilbert. The chief didn't answer. Rick left a hurried message, briefly explaining his new theory and the evidence backing it. He ended the message with, "You need to call the medical examiner and find out if the skeletons still had their marrow inside. Then call me back ASAP." He hung up. Rick fired up his truck. The radio came on, but he punched it off and rolled down his windows. He wanted all of his senses committed to observing his surroundings until Proudie was a speck in the rearview. If his theory was correct, Proudie was a very deadly place to be right now. Far more so than anyone already knew. He slowed at the last stop sign at the edge of town. He didn't stop. He didn't dare to. But his engine quieted enough for him to hear a low, whooshing sound. A deep crack, like the echo of distant thunder, came through his open window. Rick slammed the pedal to the floor. His truck lurched forward and he rocketed down the street. He only made it one block before something dark consumed his view of the road. Before he even registered the enormous thing plunging toward him, its talons smashed through the glass. Rick screamed, releasing the steering wheel as he slammed the brakes and shoved himself back into his seat. The claws flexed, missed him, and retracted as the truck flipped onto its side. Naked pavement threatened to grind Rick's shoulder through his open window while the truck slid 15 feet. Then, for a dishonest moment, all was quiet. Rick wishfully thought the worst might be over. The cab crunched inward. Tipped on its side, the truck had no shocks to absorb the impact. It crumpled beneath the weight and power of the monster that had landed on top of it. Two scimitar talons sliced through the middle of the passenger door, coming inches from Rick's right arm. He fumbled with his seatbelt, which held him fast in his overturned seat. The talons retracted. Then the whole claw smashed through the window. Glass shredded Rick's forearm as he shielded his face. One of the creature's talons stabbed into his left elbow, hooked itself in his muscles, and yanked away. Rick's seatbelt kept most of him inside the truck's cab. Most, but not all. His right arm from the elbow down went with the monstrous claw. The force of the brutal tear also ripped his shoulder from its socket, but what remained of that arm would have been useless anyway. Blood bubbled beneath the ragged tendons of his retracted bicep. The creature's feet pounded furiously against the truck as it searched for a way in to eat the rest of its dinner. Rick's uncontrollable howls of pain and terror were heard by no one but himself. The street was empty, except for him and the owl. It tried and failed to reach him once more. It wasn't moving with the targeted precision of an adept hunter anymore. It had succumbed to anger. It gripped the truck with both claws this time. 6 talons ripped through the doors like wet paper, and then Rick seemed to get heavier. He was woozy from blood loss and shock, so it took him a few dizzy seconds to realize he wasn't growing heavier. He was going higher. A sound he had mistaken for his own pounding heart was actually the strained beating of giant wings, hoisting him and the truck up into the air. And then he was falling. A flood of intoxicating chemicals washed through Rick's brain just before he smashed into the ground. Am I dying? He wondered. He felt like he was floating, and nothing, absolutely nothing, seemed real anymore. Nothing mattered. He was floating, flying up to heaven. He had died, and the swirly feeling in his head was just his soul separating from his flesh, saying a final goodbye to the sensations of the material world. But then he was falling again, fast and rapid, and for a split second everything was so abominably real again that Rick screamed a primal scream which rose from his very bowels rather than his lungs. When the truck crashed into the pavement, the second time, Rick Santini finally died. Afterwards, he felt nothing. Officer Jennings parked her cruiser in the back of the parking lot at Crosstower Baptist Church, facing the front doors, with her engine and all lights off. She watched as family after family scurried from their cars or the sidewalk through the glass double doors. She thought of Andy's glass door. She watched some kids arrive on bikes, and when they didn't immediately go inside, she whooped the sirens at them. They understood the warning and went in, looking nervously toward the distant woods as they went. Her radio crackled. "Any idea how many more are coming in?" Jennings had given her backup radio to Rose, and the two of them were tuned to a band separate from the normal police channel. No need for Ian or the other officers to hear what they were saying. "They're still coming in steady. Keep them open," Jennings replied. When people stopped showing up, or if she saw any sign of danger, Jennings was supposed to radio Rose so she and her team inside could lock all of the doors. Pastor Gabe was unaware of this plan. The others in the group were going to personally prevent him or anyone else from interfering once the doors were locked. He was going to lock the church down later anyway, right? They would simply be adjusting the schedule. Jennings had told the group they should show their guns if necessary, but not use them. She didn't want these vigilantes causing harm when they were supposed to be preventing it. Jennings hoped all of the pre-lockdown activity would draw the monster out of the woods. Then, with everyone locked safely inside, she would execute her part of the plan. Hers involved much less coordination and strategy than the rest. It involved firearms and bullets mostly. Lots of bullets. When the monster showed up looking for all the people who had gathered at Crosstower, it would find only one person waiting for it in the parking lot, and she would be ready. The bell in the church tower tolled 6 times. 1 hour until curfew officially started. 1 hour until the official lockdown began. Jennings was getting nervous. Soon, parents and children not staying overnight would be back on the road heading home. At that point, there was nothing she nor the group of brave volunteers would be able to do to protect them. They would dilute Jennings' ability to predict when the monster would strike. Fortunately, 10 minutes passed with no sign anyone else was coming. Jennings clicked the radio. "Lock it down." Rose replied immediately. 10-4. Right on cue, Jennings' cell phone rang. It was the chief. Before answering, Jennings wondered how the chief could possibly have learned what was happening so quickly. She had a speech prepared for him, but she would never have a chance to give it. Barely giving Jennings time to put the phone to her ear, the chief spouted, "Rick was wrong. We were all wrong. Those things aren't what we thought. Where are you?" "You sent me to shut down the Harvest Festival," Jennings replied. That was over an hour ago. Are you still there? Is everyone there?" Begrudgingly, Jennings answered, "Yes." "Good God. All right, stay there. Stay right there. I can't get a hold of Rick, but he left me a message. You need to hear it, and for the love of God, keep your eyes peeled." Jennings heard tires squealing on the other end of the line. She hung up. "Rose?" she called into the radio. "Here," Rose said. "Any trouble in there?" "I don't think anyone's noticed yet," Rose whispered. Jennings replied, "Good. The chief is coming by. I'll try to keep him distracted out here." 2 minutes later, the chief's personal car came barreling through the lot toward her. He pulled up so their windows were aligned, and they both rolled them down. "Chief, I can..." "There's no time, and I don't care what you're doing. Take this and listen." He passed the phone to her. He had a voicemail from Rick Santini ready to play. Jennings raised it to her ear. Rick's voice came out of the past and said, "Chief, I've got bad news. I think I was way off about those pellet things. I don't think they're a waste product like owl pellets. I think they're eggs. The good news is we've stopped 3 of them from maturing for sure, and I heard the kids got cut open too. But there's the one guy you haven't found yet. I think the parent creature is laying these eggs with the skeletons inside so the embryo can... I don't know, it's hard to say. But I think the embryos might be using the bones. Maybe the marrow? That would make the most sense, but the short story is, we've got to find that last guy's egg. I hope I'm wrong, I really do. Check on the bone marrow thing. You need to call the medical examiner and find out if the skeletons still had their marrow inside. Then call me back ASAP." The message ended. Jennings swallowed. "You understand what he's saying?" Chief Gilbert asked. Jennings nodded. "There might be another one of those things out there soon. We gotta find that missing body, and we gotta find it fast. It might already be too late. God help us." "How do you propose we do that?" Jennings demanded. "Multiple search parties over multiple days have failed. It's dark, it's Halloween, no more bodies have turned up since Andy, so that thing's probably pretty hungry by now. You want to go gallivanting in the woods tonight, Chief? Be my guest, but I'm staying here and keeping these people safe since you and your cowardly leadership lost all your credibility." Both of them sat in stunned silence. The Chief's grumbling engine was the only sound. Jennings wouldn't have dreamed of speaking to the Chief that way weeks, days, or maybe not even hours ago, but the situation just kept getting worse. She had been frustrated and scared, yes, but now she was furious. If Rick was correct, the danger could double at any moment, if it hadn't already. Jennings expected the silence to end with a tongue lashing from her superior, perhaps even an on-the-spot firing, but what the Chief said, in a tone new to her ears, was, "I'm sorry, Crystal." Jennings looked away from him. He had never called her by her first name before, almost no one ever did. When he said it, the way he said it, he wasn't speaking to her as a boss speaking to a subordinate. He was speaking as one cop, one citizen, one human being to another. Those words, "I'm sorry," were full of regret, guilt, admission, commiseration, all of the things that would have helped the Chief turn the situation around if he had felt them even 24 hours earlier. But his moment of realization came at the same time as an explosion of terrified screams inside the church. The church was still vibrating with the bell's toll when Jennings called Rose on the radio to tell her to lock it down. She repeated the order to the rest of the group: Carl, Heather, Judson, Ginny, and Bo. They had each adopted a door to watch over, and they locked them at Rose's word. "Rose?" Jennings called into the radio. "Here," Rose said. "Any trouble in there?" "I don't think anyone's noticed yet," Rose whispered. She walked briskly down the hallway near the back of the church, checking on the group members as she went. She passed Judson, who gave her a solemn nod. Pastor Gabe's voice boomed throughout the church as he addressed the festival-goers through a microphone. Cheers, laughs, and amens punctuated each of his sentences. Rose was too distracted to pay any mind to what he was saying. She found Heather guarding a door at the back of the building. It didn't appear to lead outside. "You doing all right?" she asked. "Fine. No one's even left the auditorium to use the bathroom. Must be a good time in there." "Or they're afraid to step away from the crowd," Rose said tersely. "Where does this one go?" She pointed to the door behind Heather. "Up to the bell tower," Heather said. "There's nothing but stairs leading up behind this door, but I figured if things get really crazy, people might try to climb down the tower or something." "Good catch. I hadn't thought of that," Rose said. "Do you need any water or—" A disconcerting creak interrupted her. Heather looked at Rose, confused for a moment. Then she heard it too. At first it sounded like the ceiling above them was going to break open, but then it relaxed. There was a heavy thump, and this time it clearly came from behind Heather's door. "Was someone up there?" Rose asked. Heather furrowed her brow and shook her head. "The door was already locked when I got here. I'm just making sure it stays that way." Another thump. The stairs behind the door squealed in protest. They sounded old and dry, like they weren't used to anyone using them at all. The squealing stopped. Rose put her ear to the door while Heather stood lookout. She couldn't be sure, but Rose thought she heard a punctuated sucking noise behind the door, like the hose of a vacuum being pressed against something over and over and over. It was much deeper than the hum of a vacuum cleaner, but it had the same hollow quality. The stairs groaned again. Rose kept her ear to the door. Something bumped into it and slid up and down its wooden surface. It made one long sucking sound, and Rose went white. She suddenly knew exactly what was behind the door, but it was already too late. One great blow from the creature smashed the wooden door down. It fell on top of Rose, and she felt the creature land on top of it, pinning her hard against the level loop carpet. She had lost her breath when she went down, and now she couldn't draw air under the crushing weight. Heather screamed, but her cry was cut short by a slicing blow from one of the thing's winged claws. Rose couldn't see much from beneath the door, just Heather's legs, which buckled and fought to stay upright as blood began trickling down them. Heather made a gurgling sound, then tipped over. She landed right beside Rose, their faces only inches apart. Heather didn't have much of a face left, and her throat had been torn out. The monster launched itself from the door. Its force nearly crushed Rose's ribcage, but then she was relieved of its weight. It sped down the hall, half running, half flying. Rose tried pushing the door off, but she could barely move it. She felt around for her radio, but she must have dropped it when she was knocked over. The normally stoic Judson Schultz screamed next. The abrupt silence which followed informed Rose of his fate. Carl the baker's mangled body slammed into the corner where the hall took a 45-degree angle. He left a bloody crater in the drywall. The mixed cries of Ginny and Beau, afraid for each other as much as for themselves, but ready to die avenging their son, lasted longer than any others. As Rose worked her way out from under the door, she listened to their valiant battle. Suddenly, Beau Poplar issued a stilted howl, and Ginny wailed in disharmony. Beau went silent, and Ginny only wailed a second longer. This symphony of gruesome screams served as a brief prelude to the coming cacophony of terror. Rose had slid herself halfway free when she heard the auditorium doors get atomized by a single, furious blow. Men and women cried out in unison, a churning mixture of shock, terror, and resolute dread. But it was the children, oh, the children, whose screams turned Rose's heart to soft wax, pumping ice-cold blood through her veins. She managed to reach her radio even with her legs still caught beneath the bell tower door. Not until she had the radio beside her ear did she realize a voice was shouting through it. The sickening sounds coming from the auditorium were loud enough to mask the blaring radio. "Rose, come in. What is happening in there? Repeat, what is going on in there?" Rose's vibrating thumb nearly missed the call button on the side of the radio, but she pushed it and sobbed, "It got in, Crystal. It's killing everyone." A rush of people crashed into the foyer. They moved too frantically for Rose to observe them in detail, but she saw bright, fresh blood amongst their blurry colors. The people assailed the church's front doors with hammering fists, clawed hands, and ramming shoulders. "The doors are all still locked," Jennings broadcasted. "Rose, open the damn doors and let these people out." "I know," Rose shouted aloud, but not over the radio. She heaved her legs out, letting the hefty door clap against the floor. She felt in her pockets and realized the key wasn't there. But she hadn't put it in her pocket after the involuntary lockdown. She had been swinging it mindlessly from her fingers on its stretchy band. It had been on the tip of her finger when the door hit her. "Oh, Rose, how could you have been so careless?" she scolded herself. She looked back at the door. Surely, the key was still trapped beneath its substantial weight. The caged crowd's collective voice raised in pitch and peaked at the same time Rose heard a cartoonish splattering. She forced herself not to look back at the doomed crowd, only forward at the fallen door. She had to get the key back. If other groups of people had gone to the other doors, she may still have time to save them. She had to accept the total loss of the large crowd at the main entrance. Rose poked and prodded at the fallen door, but she couldn't get her fingers beneath any part of it. The killing floor's decreasing volume told her there weren't many victims left in the foyer. Maybe some broke away toward another exit, she told herself. The idea brought negligible comfort. A woman and child were silenced simultaneously, concluding the foyer massacre. On instinct, Rose's attention shifted toward the novel silence. She saw, for the first time, the face of the bloodied monster. It did, in ways, resemble an owl. Its face was equally flat, its eyes close together and disproportionately small. Its gore-stained skin looked waxy and impermanent, like that of a human newborn before it is washed. Its beady eyes were trained down the hall, directly on Rose. She went the only way available to her, up to the belfry. Jennings and Chief Gilbert rammed and kicked at the church doors with all their strength, but they achieved no better results than the innocent people they could hear panicking inside. "Shoot it," the chief ordered. "With all those people behind it, I'll kill someone," Jennings retorted. Better one than all of them. Jennings placed a hand over her gun, flat and firm, indicating it was not leaving her holster. She shouted, "Get to my car! We'll break the doors open with it!" She started running. When she threw open her car door, Jennings saw the chief had barely made it halfway there. She didn't have time to wait for him. If something came out of that church and grabbed him, so be it. Better one than all of them, right? She flipped on her siren and accelerated toward the church's main entrance. She prayed those inside had enough awareness to see or hear her coming and move away from the doors. She passed the chief at 15 miles per hour, slowly enough to make out his angry, betrayed expression. She made one final adjustment to her trajectory and prepared to hit the brakes the second she made impact. Her foot switched pedals. Her roof caved in with a crunch. Her cruiser came to a screeching halt less than 5 feet from the church doors. Jennings felt dazed, but was conscious enough to hear the slaughter happening behind the glass. She kicked at her door until it finally swung open and grabbed her shotgun before sliding out into a crouched position with her gun pointed up at the top of her car. There was nothing there. She swung around, finger itching at the trigger, scanning the parking lot for movement. Nothing moved. Not even... "Chief?" she called out as loud as she dared. She stepped forward, boots crunching shards of her shattered windshield. There were less and less screams behind her. The alarm on a parked car close to the back of the parking lot went off. Its lights flashed in sync with its rhythmic whine. In 2 winks of the light, Jennings could see an elephantine form crawling away. It looked slow, tired maybe. It looked, did she dare to hope, weak? She moved through the parking lot stealthily, although in the perfect calm of the night, each scuff her boots made on the pavement sounded like a gunshot. Still, the creature paid her no mind. It just kept crawling away into the darkness. Finally, she had it in range. She leaned against the last car in the lot and steadied her aim at the monster's spine. Its head and vitals were faced away from her position. She had envisioned this moment, not the specific circumstances, but the basics, hundreds of times over the last 24 hours, so her finger squeezed the trigger without a thought. The monster stumbled, then pushed itself up to its hind legs as it writhed in pain. Jennings had seen too many movies. Part of her had expected the round to bounce off the creature's flesh and only serve to enrage it. In reality, the monster convulsed violently, too quickly to give Jennings another shot. When it finally turned toward her in a fitful twist, its belly split open and ejected a wet, heavy object in her direction. The object slammed against the other side of the car she was using for cover. She ignored it at first, but then considered that it might be some kind of mutant offspring or minion sent to take her down. Again, the result of too many movies. Unable to shake the idea, Jennings stooped to peer under the car. The object which had struck the other side had a face. A melted, blistered face, which vaguely resembled that of Chief Bradley Gilbert. Jennings turned away immediately. Relieved of its burden of the overweight chief of police, the monster moved double time. It launched itself into the air, did one rotation 50 feet in the starry sky, then descended at Jennings like a meteor. She aimed her gun blindly and fired off the shot she knew would be her last. Or not. The monster flapped one wing drunkenly, spiraled, then came down on top of the car in front of Jennings. She stepped back quickly, but already the creature was rising back up. It inhaled a whistling breath, and its torso came apart with a damp sucking sound. Jennings took another step back. She raised her gun, sighting in the enormous dragon thing. She aimed at its open chest with its rows of fleshy teeth, but froze. There, deep within the monster's cavity, she was looking at a human skull. She widened her view. Yes, there was a full human skeleton enveloped inside the creature. From the base of the human skull, the monster's spine grew further up. The skeleton's arms were stretched out in the directions of the monster's arms. The legs of both also pointed in unison. Veins ran from the bones of each limb into the limbs of the beast. Jennings wasted not another second before blasting the suspended skull. She heard it shatter, but did not see it break. The monster snapped shut instantly. A huff of moist air burst from its nose, and it fell backward off the car, right on top of the late Chief Gilbert. Jennings stood behind the car, panting, waiting for the thing to rise up again, but it never did. She looked away only when she heard a scream from the belfry. Rose fled up the stairs 2 at a time. The monster ran at her on clawed feet, giving itself a boost with its wings every few steps. The creature chasing Rose was less than half the size of the one Officer Jennings was battling outside, but in the narrow hallway, it looked enormous. Rose had only made it halfway up the bell tower when the murderous thing reached the base of the stairs. She had never been up to the belfry before, so she had no idea what to expect. It looked rather small from the ground, so she assumed hiding would not be an option. She had nothing with which to defend herself. Perhaps survival wasn't an option for poor, valiant Rose. Perhaps the best she could do was lead the monster away from the others and give them a chance to escape. Everyone else in the brave group had died for the cause. Now, Rose decided, it was her turn. Luckily, the thing which was so agile and adept in the open auditorium and foyer struggled in the close quarters of the staircase. It was only about 2 feet wide and spiraled upward. The flat-faced creature tried climbing straight up, using its wings to bypass the stairs, but it couldn't open them wide enough to generate any force. Maybe I can trap it here, Rose thought. She managed to create some distance by the time she reached the hatch, which had been smashed open. The weather-aged wood glowed brightly in the full moon's light where it had been freshly broken. How the creature had known where or what the hatch was, Rose would never know. She hoisted herself up into the belfry, sparing only a glance at the climbing beast below. The belfry was only about 5 feet on each side, and most of the space in the middle was dominated by the old brass bell, which hung steadily against the wind. Behind the bell, Rose saw a flat, gray mass. She had seen the hideous pellets in the police department basement, and this thing resembled those, only it had no structure. It lay like an empty sleeping bag on the wood. It also looked more organic somehow. Its exterior was moist, completely opposite from the hardened, dry clay shells of the other pellets. It came out of that thing, Rose thought, like an external womb. The newborn monster had almost reached the top. Rose couldn't shut it out, so she would have to lead it away. Once it was out of the stairwell, Rose knew the monster would quickly overcome her as it had the others, many of whom were faster and stronger than her. A shotgun went off down below in the parking lot. The sound diverted Rose's attention for a split second. She saw Crystal standing near a car at the back of the parking lot. Something dark and massive was slipping behind the car, clearly unconscious or, hopefully, dead. Rose tried yelling to Crystal, but the bell clanged dully behind her. Its cold rim nudged the small of her back, and she spun around. Her cry for help turned into a terror-stricken scream. The monster had arrived. It was angrily pushing the wide base of the bell away, struggling to create enough room to unleash its full power. Rose looked over the balustrade. Yes, she could run across the shallow angled roof, but a sheer drop of 20 or more feet awaited her at the edge. A couple of broken legs would be being swallowed whole, assuming it wouldn't simply slash her open and leave her for dead in the belfry, of course. But could she make herself jump? Rose, move! Rose was only vaguely aware of Crystal's voice from down below. She straddled the waist-high balustrade and reached for the roof with her left shoe. She touched it and flopped over the balustrade not a moment too soon. The monster swung one winged claw at her, but only brushed her with its wing's leathery skin. The momentum of her fall caused Rose to roll toward the edge of the roof. She flailed her elbows out and only barely managed to stop herself from landing like a meatball on the pavement below. She heard the balustrade splinter apart as her hunter freed itself of the confining belfry. Jennings watched Rose roll across the roof through the windshield of her cruiser as she leaned in to grab her rifle. She had run straight back to her car as soon as she saw the miniature version of the monster she had slain crawl into the belfry. She felt blindly for her AR-15, found its trusty barrel, and removed it from the rack with a jerk. She flicked off the safety and put 4 rounds through the church's glass doors. If anyone was still alive in there, they could finish smashing the now compromised glass. She then propped her elbows on the hood of her car, leaned into the stock, and put the encroaching beast in her sights. Rose got up on her hands and knees, but didn't trust her balance enough to rise any higher, not after the tumble she had just taken. Her head was swirling, dizzy from rolling and the excessive mix of chemicals being dumped into her brain. The winged monster, which now reminded her absolutely nothing of an owl, stomped toward her, and all she could do was crawl backward towards the edge. It closed in. It flared its wings as if to glide off, but then swung one claw down at Rose. One of its talons pierced her cheek deep enough to force her jaw open. She felt its cold finger inside her mouth as she screamed in muted agony. The tip of another talon cut into the side of her head, stopped only by her skull, and the third pushed threateningly against her throat. The thing pulled her by the face toward itself, and without thought, Rose clamped her teeth down on the finger penetrating her cheek. She was as shocked as the monster when her molars broke its flesh. Slimy blood oozed into her mouth, and despite her effort not to swallow, some dripped down her throat. It tasted like spoiled meat. At the same time, a shot rang out. Rose heard it zip past her shoulder. The bullet's impact caused the monster to release Rose's bleeding face. It flapped its wings once, uselessly, and Rose suddenly realized, it's like a baby bird. It hasn't learned to fly yet. This thought was no comfort to her when the creature pounced. Another shot came from below, but this one missed the whirlwind creature. It pinned Rose beneath its body, using its talons as anchors in the roof. With a sound like a boot separating from sticky mud, its belly split in two, then its chest. The gaping cavity contained one final, horrific surprise for Rose: the suspended skeleton of another human being. She shielded her eyes and prepared for the end. Jennings had her shot. The infant had opened itself to her just as its parent had. As she expected, another skull was embedded in this one's innards. It was wider than the one she had shattered with a slug from her shotgun, and similarly to when she had shot that one, she fired without hesitation. A teenager noticed the bullet holes in the glass doors. He hadn't heard any monster noises in a while and had decided to peek around to see if the coast was clear. Seeing no monster and observing the broken glass, he gathered a team of chair-wielding citizens. They smashed their way through with some effort. Some of them zipped straight out into the night. Others, the teenager included, went back through the church, shouting, "The doors are open! The doors are open!" Jennings hadn't noticed them trickling out into the parking lot when she was aiming at the beast on the roof. When she took the shot, a chorus of gasps, screams, and shouts went up from the dazed escapees. The skull, in the middle of the monster's chest, splintered apart, and the creature clammed up. Its neck stiffened, then went limp, followed by its wings, which drooped to its sides like kites without wind. For good measure, Jennings put another bullet between its eyes. Rose felt the weight of the staggering monster increase as the life drained out of it. She wriggled and wormed her body to escape before the weight crushed her. Her panic caused her to lose critical awareness of the edge of the roof. As soon as she was free, she went reeling backward. She cried out in surprise when she put a hand back to brace herself and found nothing but cold October air. Rose the dispatcher, Rose the hero, fell, a posthumous final victim of the owl. Or so she would have been. The very same observant teen who had noticed the bullet-riddled glass had seen Rose slip out from under the dying creature on the roof. Shouting unintelligibly, he had tugged at a few nearby shirts and sprinted over to where Rose would land. He, two men, and a woman, who had all noticed Rose's plight shortly after the teenager, were all there when Rose toppled over the edge. She still broke 2 ribs, dislocated her shoulder, and banged up a knee so bad it would stay bruised and swollen for 2 weeks, but she survived. Among the group that caught her, some broke fingers and hands when they crash-landed together on the cool pavement. All were scraped up and bruised to some extent, but even those with broken bones cheered like college kids at a home game when Rose got to her feet and took a deep breath, feeling more alive and grateful than ever. Their cheers were silenced when the monster, which had slaughtered so many of their friends, thudded on the pavement right beside them. They all jumped back. Those close to parked cars hid behind them, but the creature stayed still. It did not move again. Interim Police Chief Crystal Jennings stood behind the desk that had once belonged to Bradley Gilbert 1 month after the Crosstower Massacre. She hadn't bothered to personalize the desk or office for herself, since she did not plan on keeping either. She had been told countless times that if she put in for it, the chief's position would undoubtedly be given to her. But she couldn't imagine staying in Proudie any longer, not after it had been so thoroughly shattered. Clear factions had formed in the town, and they still remained even a month after the horrible Halloween night. There were those who had been at the church, most of whom had watched the younger monster eviscerate dozens of people in seconds. This group wanted to eject Mayor Ashford and elect someone who would be honest and truly serve the town's best interests. The majority of the residents, who had stayed home that night and observed nothing but a quiet evening inside, ironically thought the monster nonsense was a cover-up for something even more heinous. There was even a rumor that Chief Bradley had been driven so crazy by the citizens' disobedience that he had gone in and massacred the festival-goers himself, and that Officer Jennings had had to put him down. Rose was, herself, divided. She checked herself into a mental health facility in South Bend for a week after spending far too long one night considering permanent ways to rid herself from guilt and all the other distressing emotions she felt. On one hand, she had saved a good number of people from the newborn creature's playful bloodlust. On the other, those people were only trapped inside the church because Rose had locked the doors. How many of their deaths was she directly responsible for? Did that number outweigh those she had saved? Rose would eventually be all right, but not before some hard therapy and counseling. There's one big question I'm sure you're all asking. What about the monsters' bodies? And if you question this long enough, you'll also wonder, what about the eggs? How could anyone doubt the validity of Rose and Jennings and all of those people from the church's version of what happened on Halloween when there was so much physical evidence? There is an answer as simple as it is complex. An article published by the late Andy Laxton drew the attention of some interested parties in Washington, D.C., namely at the Pentagon. Some legally questionable surveillance validated the journalist's claims. When the egg had hatched in the belfry of Crosstower Baptist Church, a small force of men and women in black uniforms was already en route to Proudie, Indiana. While Officer Jennings was radioing out to St. Joseph County PD, trying to get medical aid for everyone at the church, 2 black helicopters marked Homeland Security on their sides landed on the church's lawn. It had simply been coincidence that the epicenter of the Halloween attack also happened to have the best landing space in town. The men and women who wore vests stamped HPA went to work immediately. Against Jennings and Rose's protests, they had wrapped tarps over both the monsters' bodies and dragged them to the helicopters. They hooked the tarps to the helicopter's struts to haul the dead monsters away. Jennings was told nothing by the agents except that she needn't worry. All evidence these things had ever existed would be erased. Jennings found this more concerning than comforting. The mysterious agents were true to their word. When Jennings returned to the police department early Sunday morning after a long night of helping people into ambulances and locating bodies, one of which belonged to a nearly unrecognizable Pastor Gabe, she was unsurprised to find the 3 eggs, not pellets, which had been in the basement, were gone. According to Ian, a man with government credentials had marched in with a small team and told him they were claiming jurisdiction before they hauled the eggs out. "What agency?" Jennings had asked. "Honestly, I was too freaked out to look closely," he admitted. The HPA agents, who may have been from something Jennings read about online called the Homeworld Protection Agency, made good on their claim of destroying all evidence. Everything, including Andy Laxton's WordPress article, evaporated. Jennings received a few reports from citizens that photos and videos of the attack had vanished from their phones. She had asked the citizenry to send her any evidence they had, but no one could come up with even a blurry image of the monster seen by so many that night. Roughly a quarter of Proudie's already small population fled immediately. Another 1/5 of the remaining residents would leave in the next year. They abandoned businesses, friends, even family in some cases. But Proudie just wasn't the same anymore. What had made the community great was how well everyone got along, how well they worked together, how they could always find a compromise or a solution to any problem. The events of October 2020 had changed all of that, apparently for good. Now the slightest disagreement ended up in civil court. Almost every vote came to a near tie, and there was no real majority on either side of any decision made. The town voted to keep Gina Ashford in place even though no one really wanted her. They just didn't want to elect the believer, as those who claimed to have seen the monster became known, who ran against Ashford. Crystal Jennings, interim police chief and Queen believer, knew she would have to leave Proudie too if she ever wanted to do real police work again. The department had been so incurably handicapped by Chief Gilbert's dishonesty and the ongoing rumors that he had murdered the people at Crosstower. Even those who knew the truth would never trust the department again, even if Jennings took charge. They simply couldn't see past the lies they had been fed before. During her stint as interim chief, Jennings dedicated most of her time to digging up information about the mysterious HPA, or Homeworld Protection Agency. It was impossible to tell fact from fiction online, but nearly every thread mentioned extraterrestrial or paranormal creatures and entities. If the forums and blogs were to be believed, the Homeworld Protection Agency was really in charge of Area 51 and was deeply embedded in NASA and SpaceX. Jennings wasn't sure where to go next, until one day she received a phone call from an unregistered number. In law enforcement, this isn't uncommon. Most officers block their numbers from those they call when on the job. But this call was unlike any other she had ever received. "Am I speaking with Officer Crystal Jennings of Proudie, Indiana?" a naturally smooth male voice on the line asked. "Yes," Jennings replied briefly. She almost didn't give the mysterious caller even that much information. "Officer Jennings, I'm from the Pentagon. Is this a bad time?" "That depends. What's this about?" Jennings asked, making her suspicion as obvious as possible. "This is a follow-up call about an incident which allegedly took place in Proudie on October 31st, 2020. I'm checking into—" "Are you with the HPA?" Jennings asked. The line went quiet for 3, 4, 5 seconds. Finally, the man spoke again. "I cannot confirm nor deny the existence of any such group." Jennings started to say goodbye when the man's voice suddenly raised in pitch and he said, "Hold on. You clearly have questions that I cannot answer, but I also know you won't stop digging until you get something. I'm hoping we can come to an agreement here." Jennings said, "Try me." "See, your old friend Andy Laxton caused us a bit of a headache when he went public about what was going on there. You've probably noticed his articles disappeared. I'll be straight with you, officer. If Mr. Laxton was still alive when we arrived in Proudie, he may have disappeared as well. Now, I know how that sounds, believe me. It hurts me deep in my patriotic bones to admit it, but there's a lot about this world that people don't know." Disgusted, Jennings asked, "How deep does this damn cover-up go? I thought it ended with the mayor here." The man on the phone laughed. He seemed to find this genuinely funny. When he stopped, he said, "I imagine my agency and your mayor have similar motives for keeping a lid on things, avoiding panic being the primary one. But listen, I have a special offer for you since you single-handedly took out 2 of those things. I imagine you're not going to stop digging until you find the answers you're looking for and, well, you digging too far wouldn't be good for either of us." "So what are you saying? I take your deal or you kill me?" No. The man had sounded fairly honest up until that point. Now he sounded like he wanted to get off the topic of what might happen to curious Officer Jennings. "This is a good faith offer my department is making to you. In exchange for your silence and leaving things be, I will tell you everything we know about the creatures that attacked your town. Now, if you record this conversation, I can promise you 2 things. First, the recording will be destroyed before you can do anything with it. And second, like I said earlier, it wouldn't be good for you." "I'm not recording," Jennings said spitefully. "Good. So we have a deal?" Jennings looked around the office at all of Chief Gilbert's things. Would taking this deal make her any better than him? Would hiding pertinent information from the public just to get answers for yourself be justified? Well, maybe, she thought. If at least one person knows what really happened, maybe it can be prevented from happening again. Would this mean she would have to stay in Proudie after all? Possibly. Into the phone, she said, "Fine. Tell me." The man cleared his throat. There are things living deep in the oceans and jungles of this planet which the general public has no knowledge of. There are also things underground. Now, most of the things living down there originally lived on the surface and went below to escape some natural disaster, be it a flood, a meteor, what have you. The creature which attacked your town is one of these underdwellers. It found an escape through a cave and eventually found its way to your little town. Hold on, Jennings interrupted. You're saying more of these things might find us? Oh no, don't worry about that. We located the problem and sealed off the passage. I can't tell you where it was though. I hope you understand. I guess. Right. Well, what was fascinating about this creature was how it seemed to regain its surface abilities so quickly. Like flying? Jennings asked. To some extent, maybe. You'd actually be surprised how much open space exists below ground. It might have been flying its whole life. What I mean was mostly sight. It's pitch dark in most places in the underworld. A few of the things living down there don't even have eyes anymore. It seemed like it tracked us mostly with smell, Jennings said. Good observation. You're probably right. Anyway, I think you've figured out its reproductive process. It utilizes a victim's body for both its own nourishment and to generate the building blocks for an offspring. Thankfully, only one of said offspring made it through gestation in Proudie. You people ruined the other 3 by cutting them open. Hey, wait, Jennings stopped him. Did your agency find a 5th egg? We only had 4 if you count the one that was in the belfry. Well, I suppose it can't hurt to tell you. Yes, we found the egg with the bones of a child inside. I believe a Joshua Poplar went missing a few days before the attack. Yeah, that's him, Jennings confirmed. Well, my apologies for not providing the family any closure, but Jennings interrupted again. His parents were killed. Ah, well, that's terrible, but I must say, it's convenient for us. The line went quiet, and Jennings shuffled through her thoughts from the past weeks, trying to find any questions she still wanted answers to. She searched her mind for anything she might need to ask in order to keep herself and the people she was charged with protecting safe. Of course, she could have asked about the other types of creatures apparently living below the surface of the earth, but she supposed the man wouldn't discuss those with her now. So she asked a much simpler question. What do you people call those things? What, the creatures that attacked Proudie? He asked. Yeah. We don't have very catchy names. Anything we discover is given a code, like a serial number. That particular species is called UW12. We called it the owl, Jennings said distantly, as if daydreaming, or whatever the nightmare version of a daydream is. The owl, huh? Oh, because of the... Yeah, I get it. That's good. I'm going to use that, I think. The owl. Can you tell me one more thing? Jennings asked. That depends, said the mysterious man on the other end of the line. Jennings leaned back in Chief Gilbert's chair. How does somebody like me get to work with somebody like you? After a long pause on the other end, the man finally said, I was hoping you'd ask.